In 1985, Austrian People's Party candidate Kurt Waldheim ran in the country's federal presidential election. While ordinarily this would not be shocking in any way, Waldheim's past would turn this election into a turning point in Austrian history. During World War II, Waldheim had served as an intelligence officer in the Wehrmacht, operating in Greece, Yugoslavia, and the USSR, where some of the most heinous Nazi crimes were perpetrated. His past was viciously attacked by the opposing Social Democrats, but Waldheim affirmed his innocence and stoked nationalist and anti-Semitic sentiments, pushing the idea that he, and Austrians more broadly, were respectable victims of the Nazis rather than willing compatriots. This event caused the prevailing historical memory of Austria during the Nazi era to be reassessed, and began the decline of the Austrian victim theory. This theory, formed immediately after the war and adopted by both wings of Austrian politics, becoming a foundational myth for the new Second Austrian Republic, stated that Austria was the first victim of Nazi occupation, and allowed bitter political rivals to unite and former Nazis to be reintegrated into society, while Jewish victims were relegated to the sidelines. This video examines the origins of the theory, Austria's involvement in the Holocaust and complicity in Nazism, and the decline of the theory and Nazism's legacy in modern Austria. On the 27th of April 1945, the Austrian Social Democrats, People's Party, and the Communists declared an independent Austrian Republic in the wake of Allied liberation. In this declaration, they stated the following, quote, "The Democratic Republic of Austria has been restored and is to be refurbished in the spirit of the Constitution of 1920. The annexation forced upon the Austrian people in the year 1938 is henceforth declared null and void." It went on further to quote from the Moscow Declaration in October 1943, saying that Austria was, quote, "the first free country which fell victim to Hitler's aggression." The Moscow Declarations also accused all of Austrian society as being complicit in Hitlerite aggression. However, these parties countered that assertion by claiming that Austrians were powerless and bereft of free will in the wake of the Anschluss. These declarations, carefully worded by Stalin and co-signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek, were only intended to inspire homegrown Austrian resistance and assign co-responsibility, but ended up legitimizing the myth of victimization. The Austrian government officially codified the victim theory in 1946, when they published the Red, White, Red book. This book was an official state document intended to provide an argumentation strategy for the victim theory, citing official source documents and arguing for treatment as a liberated state. A monument to the Red Army was erected in Vienna in August 1945, and in 1946 a semi-official exhibition was held in the Viennese Artists' House, where anti-fascist slogans and art were on display. This was all part of a concerted effort by the Austrian state to disseminate top-down anti-fascist propaganda. However, it crucially ignored discussions of Austrian Jews and the camps. There were four core tenets of the myth. Firstly, the Anschluss was not a union of Germanic nations, but a violent seizure by a foreign power. Secondly, the period 1938 to 1945 should be considered a foreign occupation. Thirdly, Austrian resistance made a prominent contribution in fighting the Nazis despite the repression. And fourthly, Austrian soldiers in the Wehrmacht were forced to serve under the threat of terror and death. This anti-fascist propaganda, however, was abandoned by 1948 to 49 as it failed to effectively forge a unified national identity and Austrian citizens failed to identify with it. The process of denazification was initially harsh, with 14,000 people being sentenced, 43 of which were given death, of which 30 were actually executed. Denazification was slowly halted from 1947, and 90% of some 550,000 Austrians affected by the policy were amnestied. As a matter of political expediency, the votes of former Nazis were highly coveted from 1949 onwards. Political parties began to pander to former National Socialists, similar to the myth of the Clean Wehrmacht, which developed during the anti-communism of the Cold War. The OVP, People's Party, and SPO, Socialist Party, officially denounced the anti-fascist liberation struggle to both disassociate themselves from the Communist Party and affirm themselves as patriotic. The Communists, who inarguably formed the backbone of the marginal and ineffectual Austrian resistance, were ostracized, persecuted, and quickly lost their political influence. Victims of the concentration camps were told to stop talking about the horrors they experienced by prominent politicians, as people didn't want to hear about it anymore. Austrian politics were now ruled by a two-party system, with a smaller force called the Federation of Independents, which was a union of former Nazis, becoming the third largest political grouping in Austria. While Austrian Jews were denied restitution and even met with fervent anti-Semitism upon their return, Austrian radio broadcasts and newspapers reported on the return of Austrian POWs, and high-ranking politicians delivered homecoming speeches, honouring their service and portraying them as martyrs. Those who had been held in Soviet captivity in particular were now the true victims. The crux of the victim theory can be summarized by the following quote from Rosa Jochman, Social Democrat ideologist and Ravensbrück prisoner in 1949. "We all were the victims of fascism. A soldier who has come home through the war in its worst form at the front was the victim. The population of the home front, who has been afraid of waiting for air raid alarms and who has been dreaming of getting rid of bombing horror, was the victim. Those who had to leave their motherland were the victims. And finally, we, unprotected victims of the SS, inmates of prisons and camps, were the victims." The point of the theory was thus to forget Austria's criminal past, and this was reinforced by the Austrian state outright denying Jews, gypsies and political opponents support and compensation. They were portrayed as trying to enrich themselves at the expense of all the Nazis' victims. Similar again to the clean Wehrmacht myth, the victim theory was officially adopted so that Austrian citizens could forget about the terrible things they participated in or overlooked, and so they wouldn't feel any sense of guilt. There was thus no need for uncomfortable introspection. Other practical reasons were that the victim status would officially end Allied occupation of Austria and ensure the Austrian state would not have to pay reparations to Jewish victims. Although the Allies successfully pressured the government to pay damages, the Austrians managed to not acknowledge their responsibility. From the 1950s, veteran societies began to pop up all over the country along with war memorials. Nationalism began to grow, and common cause between German and Austrian veterans of the war almost threatened another Anschluss concerning the Allies. These memorials began to act instead as patriotic shrines. While this was happening, monuments to anti-fascist heroes like Franz Mayer and monuments at concentration camps such as the one at Ebensee were demolished. When the Austrian State Treaty was signed in 1955, Allied occupation officially ended, and Austrians began lamenting the Allied occupation as a hostile one. The 15 years of conservative rule under Leopold Feigl and Julius Raab saw the victim theory reach its peak, with absolute and uncompromising denial of guilt in Nazi crimes. Nazism was treated as an external and foreign influence, but as we will now examine, the reality was very different. Prior to the Anschluss, Austria was a fascist state ruled by two dictators, first Engelbert Dollfuss and later Kurt Schuschnigg from July 1934, after Dollfuss was assassinated by Austrian Nazis. At that time, despite pressure for an Austro-German union, both Dollfuss and Schuschnigg were determined to maintain Austria's independence, and Austria received the backing of Mussolini and fascist Italy to this end. The left had been neutered after the four-day civil war starting on February 12th, which pitted the Austro-fascist state against the Social Democrats and Communists, who were banned and persecuted in its wake. Ties between Austria and Italy began to break down after the Abyssinian crisis, which saw Mussolini form closer ties with Hitler, and Nazism began to increase in popularity. The Austrian state could no longer rely on Italy's military support to guarantee their independence. Concessions were made to Hitler until 1938, when ultimately the Anschluss on March 12 saw Austria integrated into the Greater German Reich. Anti-Semitism was already rife in Austria, and all major parties, including the Social Democrats, had exhibited anti-Semitic tendencies. Karl Renner, first leader of the Austrian Republic and SPO party figure, had publicly advocated for the Anschluss, despite distancing himself from National Socialism. From 1920, Austria had been governed by parties with openly anti-Semitic platforms, and Renner himself was a notorious anti-Semite. After Nazi troops marched into Austria, they were greeted by cheers, and political enemies of the Reich began to be jailed. 250,000 Austrians cheered at Vienna's central square as Hitler delivered a speech on March 15th. The Federal Army of the Austrian state was not considered a danger at all to the invading German troops. On March 13th, they swore an oath of allegiance to Hitler, much like Wehrmacht troops had to do a few years prior. Pogroms broke out spontaneously across the country, even before the Anschluss began, as the country began a process of Aryanization. Jews were forced into scrubbing details and made to clean anti-fascist slogans off the sidewalks. Unlike the treatment of Jews in Germany, whose persecution was slow and methodical initially, Austrian Jews dealt with persecution immediately after Austria's integration into the Reich. Many were beaten, homes robbed, and some were killed. English journalist G.E.R. Gedge, reporting for the Daily Telegraph, called the Vienna pogroms, quote, an indescribable witches' Sabbath. Karl Zuckmayer, German writer, described it as, quote, the opening of the gates of the underworld. What was horrifically unique about this wave of anti-Semitic violence was that none of it was directed nor ordered by Hitler or the Nazi authorities, but emerged organically in response to the Anschluss. As American historian Evan Buki states, quote, "Anti-Semitism was the irresistible chord that attracted millions of ordinary people otherwise immune to the siren song of Hitlerism. From May, the Nuremberg laws that affected German Jews now extended to Austrian Jews. In November 1938, the Nazi state encouraged a widespread pogrom of Jews in response to the assassination of diplomat Ernst von Rath, which would later be referred to as Kristallnacht. Brown shirts and civilians across the Reich looted Jewish businesses, ransacked homes, beat and assaulted Jews in the streets, and raped and murdered many. It became clear at this point to Austrian Jews that everyday life would no longer be possible, but options to flee were few and far between, and became near impossible when World War II broke out in September 1939. From fall 1941, deportations began, not just of Jews but also ethnic minorities like Slovenes and Gypsies. During the war, Austrian industry and agriculture benefited heavily from the forced labor of occupied territories, much like Germany. 1 million forced laborers, including 250,000 POWs, worked in Austrian industry during the war. The idea that Austrians were dragged kicking and screaming into the war is also false. Some 800,000 Austrians volunteered to join the Wehrmacht, and a further 150,000 joined the Waffen-SS, the Nazi Party's armed wing. In total, about 1.3 million Austrians served in the Wehrmacht. Since the Wehrmacht recruited 17.3 million men in total, this means about 7.5% of the Wehrmacht soldiers were Austrians, a significant overrepresentation. Austrian historian Helmut Conrad also points out that out of a population of 6.8 million in 1938, 700,000 Austrians were members of the Nazi Party, while only 100,000 were active opponents of the regime. The Austrian resistance centered largely around the Communist Party, along with left-wing Social Democrats and even Trotskyite splinters. Conservative resistance centered around the Catholic Church and monarchist groups, but these were extremely marginal. Furthermore, while I don't consider it particularly helpful to name individuals, it is interesting to note how many Austrians occupied prominent positions in the Nazi Party. Our favourite Austrian painter at the helm of the regime, Adolf Eichmann being one of the chief orchestrators of the final solution, along with Arthur Seyss-Inquart and Karl Brunner to name a few, were some of the most prominent Nazi officials, all of them Austrian. With its integration into the Reich, the lack of opposition to Nazi racial policies being enacted in their territory, and the marginality of the resistance during the war, it is clear that Austria was not a victim, but rather a willing participant in Nazi rule and atrocities. Anywhere from 65 to 70,000 Austrian Jews, 9 to 10,000 Gypsies, and 4 to 5,000 resistance fighters were murdered by the Nazi regime. For a long time after the war, the myth was prominent in the Austrian conscience. War memorials such as the one erected at Regensburg Castle in 1963 celebrated the service of Austrian World War II veterans, characterizing their service as an eternal struggle against the assault from the East, where soldiers had to give their lives for the preservation of Christian culture and the freedom of the West. Attempts to remember anti-fascist resistors were slandered as communist-inspired. A transformation during the 60s and 70s began to occur, however. Generational change accompanied cultural change. While the trial of Adolf Eichmann was occurring in Israel, a play titled Der Herr Karl was performed in 1961. Astonishingly, this play had more of an impact on Austrian culture than the Eichmann trial, as the play poked fun at a conformist character, symbolic of the average Austrian during the war. In the words of critic Hans Weigel, quote, "Mr. Karl just wanted to kick a certain type of person in the shin, and now a whole nation is yelling ouch." Another major event was the affair surrounding Tara Borodajkovics. Tara was a professor at the Vienna University of World Trade, well known for anti-Semitic and pan-Germanic lectures. While socialist students had protested his continued employment for many years, they found little support even within their party. Borodajkovics published an essay which attracted media attention, and a press conference in March 1965 turned the affair into a scandal, where the professor proudly announced his voluntary membership of the Nazi Party. The surrounding protests saw a communist resistance member during the war, Ernst Kirchweger, killed by a fascist extremist. His funeral marched through the streets of Vienna along with 25,000 people, including most ministers in the federal government. The myth continued to evolve throughout the 70s, where resistance figures were now incorporated into the national identity and the custom of public culture of commemoration. While the resistance did exist, they were very marginal, and using the movement as a historical reference point for the Second Republic was ahistorical. Nevertheless, it signified a transformation in popular memory. In 1975, Simon Wiesenthal, who had worked to hunt down Adolf Eichmann, publicly identified FPO chairman Friedrich Peter as a member of the 1st SS Infantry Brigade. This led to a smear campaign against Wiesenthal, and Peter himself defended his actions by saying, quote, "I merely fulfilled my duty." In 1983, however, prominent intellectuals and politicians placed advertisements expressing their opposition to Peter's participation in the government. Reversal of opinion progressed gradually over the years, as shows exposing the horrors of the Holocaust were aired on television and photographs from the war were widely publicized. While this was going on, however, there was little discourse on the nature of, quote, everyday fascism in Austria, but an event in 1986 would act as a turning point in the victim myth. That year, Austria had its presidential elections, and Kurt Waldheim, a former Wehrmacht intelligence officer, was running as the OVP's candidate. There was great controversy and consternation when Waldheim's service in the Nazi army came to light. Waldheim had written an autobiography earlier, and journalist Alfred Worm identified several key omissions from 1938 to 1945. Waldheim's war records demonstrated that he had lied about a medical discharge in 1942, and the World Jewish Congress alleged that he had concealed his work as a special missions officer in Greece and Yugoslavia. Further allegations, substantiated by Wehrmacht war records, accused Waldheim of directly participating in and facilitating Nazi mass murder in occupied territories. Waldheim's defense, much like many Nazi soldiers, rested on the idea that he was simply fulfilling his duty, whilst also attacking his accusers and dog-whistling about a Jewish plot to undermine his campaign. OVP Secretary General Michael Graf even set the standard that, quote, "As long as it cannot be proved that he personally strangled 6 Jews, there is no problem," a standard that I'm not even sure Adolf Hitler would meet. An image of Waldheim in Wehrmacht uniform resurfaced, bringing back harsh memories of the war and the Holocaust. The US State and Justice Departments later found evidence in 1987 directly implicating Waldheim in Nazi persecution and mass murder, forbidding him from entering the United States, making him the first head of state to be barred from the country. Most other countries, barring Arab states and the Vatican, declared him persona non grata. Although Kurt Waldheim did win the presidency, the controversy starkly divided Austrian society and forced many to reevaluate their country's role in World War II. International outrage and coverage of the election also influenced this. The victim thesis transformed into a co-responsibility thesis. Socialist Chancellor Franz Vranitzky, in a 1991 speech to Parliament, acknowledged Austria's role in the Nazi regime, not as a victim but as a perpetrator, declaring the following, quote, "We acknowledge all of our history and the deeds of all parts of our people, the good as well as the evil. As we lay claim to the good, so must we apologize to the survivors and the descendants of the dead for the evil." Many Austrians greeted the Anschluss, supported the Nazi regime, and upheld many levels of the hierarchy. Many Austrians took part in the repressive measures and persecution of the Third Reich, some of them in prominent positions. Even today, we cannot brush aside our moral responsibility for the deeds of our citizens. Austrian politicians have always put off making this confession. I would like to do this explicitly, also in the name of the Austrian government, as a measure of the relationship we today must have to our history, as a standard for the political culture of our country. Vranitzky made a similar speech during a 1993 visit to Israel, which was met positively by Austrians, with 81% agreeing with the Chancellor's sentiments. Vranitzky was not alone, however, with other political leaders in European countries, such as Czechoslovakia, Romania, and even East Germany, making similar admissions of guilt. By this stage, the victim myth, while still upheld by marginal factions of Austrian politics, had otherwise been recognized as just that, a myth. With the official debunking of the victim theory, the legacy of Nazism in Austria had changed. From 1995, the Austrian government implemented programs to address gaps in post-war restitution and compensate the victims of Nazism. In 1995, the National Fund for Victims of National Socialism was created and an art restitution law implemented in 1998. However, things were not perfect. The Wehrmacht War Crimes exhibition, which had been shown in Germany in the 90s, was revised and put on display in Austria in 2002, creating similar controversy amongst the right-wing and Wehrmacht veterans. As time goes on, however, and Holocaust survivors, resistance members, and those alive at the time of World War II pass away, there is a reduced awareness of the legacy of National Socialism. A survey commissioned by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany in 2019 found that only 58% of Austrians over the age of 18 said the Holocaust referred to the extermination of Jews, with 69% saying it took part in Germany. 56% did not know that 6 million Jews had been killed, and only 51% had still heard of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief orchestrators of the Holocaust, and an Austrian. While much has been done to atone for the Holocaust not just in Austria but the rest of Europe as well, the growing disconnect between European citizens and World War II, with the rise of far-right politics in the continent, may be a cause for concern. Following World War II, in an effort to unite and forge a new national identity, the leaders of the Second Austrian Republic created the victim theory, claiming that the nation was the first victim of Nazi tyranny and thus had little to no responsibility in fascist atrocities. The theory guided the nation's attitude to the war for decades and acted as a way to forge unity between the country's disparate political factions. Events in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, most notably the Waldheim affair in 1986, caused the theory to be reevaluated, and Austrian politicians and the broader public started to officially acknowledge their nation's active participation in Nazi crimes against humanity. Steps were taken from the 90s onwards to make restitution for the damage done during the war, and while many in Austria remain partially ignorant on the finer details of the Holocaust, popular memory and cultural awareness today is in a far better place than it was 70 years ago. Thanks for watching.